Boss fights. The signal that you have reached the end of a game, a level, a world, a chapter, or whatever you want to call it. Usually the most memorable part of a game. If you want to hear more about that, I made an entire video on that, and I do recommend you go watch that before this one. Because if bosses signal the end of a section of your game, what does it mean when the game is nothing but boss fights? Think about games like Dark Souls and Cuphead and Shadow of the Colossus. Today we take a closer look at these games and talk about why they're not just a boss rush, because, believe it or not, largely they're not really boss fights. So if you've seen my last video on the topic of boss fights, linked up top in the cards and down below in the description, you'll know that I see a boss fight as a way for the game to challenge and test the player on the skills that they have developed during regular gameplay. Are you playing a platformer? Then a boss level should probably be based around making difficult jumps with a twist added in, like in Super Meat Boy, where Dr. Fetus is shooting missiles at you while you're trying to play through this very difficult platforming level, as well as adding an auto-scrolling element to the level by way of these moving saw blades. Compare this to the fights in Cuphead, where, well, they're just kind of there. There are some levels that are not based on fighting a single enemy, you know how I call them an enemy, not a boss. But those don't really lead into the fights or have anything in common with them, really. Hell, some of the fights even have totally unrelated controls and put you inside of this plane. Let me put it this way. In order to be a boss, you need something to be a boss of. If you're a business owner and you have no employees, you're not a boss. In the same way, if you're a fight in a video game with nothing leading up to it, you're not really a boss fight either, you're just a fight. These fights aren't bosses because they themselves are the level. Every fight introduces something new to look out for, patterns to learn and tricks to master, almost none of which will carry over to the next fight. The idea of bosses being the actual levels themselves becomes even more clear when looking at a game like Shadow of the Colossus. In this game you have to climb onto these giant monsters, maneuver around them and wait for the perfect moment to strike. You hardly feel like you're fighting a single enemy, rather you're struggling to overcome all of the odds to somehow take down this absolute titan of a beast. Even the smaller ones, it feels like more than just a fight, it's a whole experience on its own. With this game, because the theme and the visuals really hammer this idea home, it's easier to see how an encounter with these monsters is closer to a traditional video game level than a boss fight. But if you scale that back to almost any Souls-like game, you'll find that for the most part, the same holds true. Let's talk about something that I mentioned in my video where I explained why Mario Sunshine isn't really a platformer. In that video I talk about the relationship between the goal of a game and the obstacles put in place between the player and that goal. In all games that I talk about today, those obstacles don't really share any coherent theme. If, for instance, you find yourself in an area where enemies charge at you and you need to dodge to the side to make them bash their head into a wall to stun them, so they're open for you to attack them. And then you get to the big boss fight and you notice him charging at you. There's a link between these little monsters and the boss fight. As it is, that is largely not the case in these games. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's bad design for there to be no priming for the fight beforehand. That is the whole point of these games. You walk into a fight blind to what's about to happen, and through some very difficult trial and error, you start to pick up on patterns, attacks and weaknesses and such. If you expose those mechanics to the player beforehand, half the point of these games get lost. All I'm saying is that I don't think it's really fair to call these fights boss fights just because there's only one of them and they're really big and mean monsters. So, does that mean a game can't have boss fights unless there's a gimmick involved? Because it certainly sounds like that's what I'm saying, doesn't it? To answer that question, we have to talk about a game that so far I've kind of been avoiding. While I'm using a lot of Souls-like gameplay to talk about things that seem like bosses but really aren't, the funny thing is the boss fights in Dark Souls are actually bosses. What makes them different? They don't really have a gimmick going on that's consistent between the regular enemies and the boss fights, right? No, but the gameplay loop is the same, which is just as relevant, if not more. Really, it's the same thing that I've been talking about all this time, it's just a little less in your face. The whole thing with Dark Souls is you fight, you die, you learn, you repeat. Any individual enemy won't pose that much of a threat, but it's not about figuring out how to beat a single enemy. It's about trying to figure out how to best take on enemies one at a time or in smaller groups, so you don't get swarmed and die instantly. The boss fights have the same loop, though with different mechanics. In the normal gameplay, you're trying to find a path that works well for you, while the boss fights, you're trying to learn the attack patterns. The thing that connects these two different styles of the gameplay is the way you learn incrementally. Before writing this video, I had only ever seen footage from Dark Souls, never played the game for myself. And then when I got started with the script, I fully planned on including Dark Souls as an example of how something can look like a boss fight, but not actually be one. Then I played a couple of hours of Dark Souls 3 and that changed my mind. Inside of these worlds, you make your way from one bonfire to the next. These function as a sort of checkpoint, but really, you can also see them as a cutoff point, where one level ends and the next level starts. If you look at it in that light, it suddenly makes a lot more sense why there aren't any bonfires just before a boss fight. There aren't separate levels, there are elements inside of a level, the final challenge of that sequence. Now, plenty of games do make separate levels for their boss fights, and instead of just putting them at the end of a level. Both work very well, but including the boss at the end of a level, rather than allowing the player to get healed before the boss fight, the performance of the level itself becomes relevant to the boss fight. Can you make it all the way to the boss without losing too much health? No? Well, then the boss fight is gonna be a problem for you. You have to master the level before you are able to stand even a chance against these boss fights. This is how, without gimmicks, Dark Souls manages to tie in the bosses to its levels. And while I have some other issues with the game I played, those are mainly based on me disliking the controls, not the game design. That part, I think at the very least, is masterfully done. Really, it's funny how these Souls-like games started to be its own subgenre of video games, but most of those games turn into a glorified boss rush, which, without a game in between them, it's not much of a boss rush anymore. Well, the game that inspires it actually manages to tie all these things together very, very well. I guess most developers just kind of missed the memo on that one. Or maybe the genre name is just not quite right, because it's totally fine for a game not to have boss fights, as is the topic of my last video. Going back to Cuphead for a moment, this game does actually have at least one boss fight. You could say it's the final boss in a sense, but it's not really. The last fight of the game is against the devil, but before you can face him you have to face King Dice, who has a number of simpler mini-bosses you have to work your way through. If you're clever with your parry, you can influence which fights and how many fights you have to face, and most of them test one specific skill you've mastered throughout the game, whether that be dodging a lot of tiny projectiles, positioning yourself on the screen properly to avoid upcoming attacks, dashing through small gaps, jumping back and forth between platforms, and so on. Then, when you get the actual fight against King Dice, you need to be able to parry to avoid his attacks. In most fights up until now, the parry was pretty much just a way for you to get a little power boost and also to avoid certain attacks. In this one, if you can't time your parry right, combined with positioning yourself in the right place, you will not be able to get through this fight. In short, King Dice is the only real boss fight in Cuphead. I feel like after all this talk about things that aren't really boss fights, I should probably provide some examples of games that I think do boss fights at least decently well, to contrast my reasons and why everything so far has not really been a boss fight. As I said in my last video, Mario Odyssey does an amazing job integrating boss mechanics into the worlds you find them in, or integrating world mechanics into the boss fights. Either way works. Crash Bandicoot 4. Wait, no, not that one! Yeah, that one is much better. This game, much like Mario Odyssey, relies on gimmicks to tie in its bosses to its worlds. The quantum masks, because yeah, it has to sound sci-fi. God, I hate that trope. Allow you to do things like shifting gravity, slowing down time, floating around and phasing through objects. A boss like Andrio, however, once he hulks out, can only be damaged with the super spin ability the purple mask gives you. I'm not saying this is a particularly creative or well implemented mechanic for the boss fight, but it does use the mechanic that you've been getting used to over the last few levels inside of this fight. The implementation of the time mask against the Cortex fight is much better, by the way. The first boss, Engine, doesn't really use any of these mechanics. It's just a good old Crash Bandicoot boss fight based on normal gameplay mechanics that we're all by now pretty used to. Then technically you also have a boss fight on this surfboard thingy, but I don't know, it seems more like a mini boss than anything else. Something more to spice up the gameplay with variety than serving any gameplay related purpose. I think this game strikes a pretty good balance between having the gimmicks you play with be used inside of the boss fight, but not having it feel as formulaic as beat a boss, get a mask, beat the next boss, repeat. And to my point of the difference between a world boss and a final boss I made in my last video, the final boss of this game is a gauntlet where you get tested on all your abilities with these gimmicks one at a time. And for added bonus points, the true final boss then uses those exact same powers against you, turning things on their head, quite literally. All that being said, as a game with multiple playable characters, I would have liked a level where you swap between every single character before the boss fight. The way a boss fight tests your skill can be very easily substituted by a level that takes advantage of all of the mechanics. Something that this game actually does do with one of its final obstacles in the game, where you have to use all 4 masks in very close succession without any moment to rest. If anything, this is the true final boss of Crash Bandicoot 4. To make a long story short, not every big enemy with a mean face is a boss fight, and not every game needs a boss fight. Will I be upset if you call any given fight inside Cuphead a boss? No, I get what you mean. But I also think that realizing why you put in a boss fight instead of just doing it is a valuable piece of info as a game designer, and it can provide some insight for critical thinking as the player. Next time, let's drop all this boss fight talk and talk about something a little bit more lighthearted, shall we? But that's a story for another time. So until then, don't forget to leave a like on this video and subscribe to stay up to date with my newest content.